Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this room, but also attending this talk online. And also thank you so much for that lovely and amazing introduction, Jay and Nan, also who have been organizing this this entire ISB 14 for many, many years. It's such a big privilege and honor to be able to share my research with you all today. So before I start my talk, I would like to do two things. The first one is I will start with a quick positionality statement of myself, and then I will present to you a quote that I want you to hold on to until the end of my talk. So for my positionality, I am an early career researcher who is an experimental linguist or psycholinguist, if you would like to go in that route. But I do incorporate both quantitative and qualitative techniques in my research. And one of the big parts of my research has always been diversity and centering diversity in all the questions that I ask. And as an early career scientist, I've always found myself being challenged by the questions that are asked about diversity. And again, this is a very privileged position right now that I get to talk about my research on diversity in such a big and impactful conference. So thank you all so much again for organizing ISB 14 and centering diversity as the main point. The second thing that I would like to do is, again, to share with you all this quote that I believe summarizes everything that I'll be talking about today. And this is a quote from Yajesi's Transcending Kingdom. The book is titled Transcending Kingdom. And the quote goes like this: some people make it out of their stories unscathed, thriving, and some people don't. So please keep this quote in the back of your mind somewhere until the end of my talk. And I hope that it will become clear why I chose this one. All right, so let's get started with the structure of my talk, which is mostly going to be about spoken language and especially the domain of speech perception. And the way that I will be doing this is basically start problematizing everything from the beginning. And that problem begins with this. In everyday life, listeners encounter highly varied speech because speech itself, or the spoken utterances themselves, are very complex and dynamic. But what we've been doing in our research is trying to mimic this, that taking all that variation, stripping out everything about variation and trying to categorize things in a very simple way. And trying to do this, trying to boil down all that variation into just simple discrete units or categories may not be actually the best way to approach understanding spoken language, but also especially understanding spoken language in linguistically diverse communities. So this is what this talk is going to be about. And of course, I believe that under the theme of ISB 14, diversity now, what I would like to do is dividing my entire talk into two. The first section will be trying to problematize theoretical and methodological issues that we encounter when we bring in diversity. And the second section will be on ecological and experiential outcomes. So what happened to us as researchers and what happened to our participants or living subjects of or experiencers of languages, what happened to them at the end of our, or as a result of our research. So let's come back to this point. Listeners encounter highly variable speech or acoustic signal in everyday life. This is a fact. You can go into all the 101 phonetics courses. You will see that speech is dynamic. Not one individual's utterances will mimic even the prior utterances. It's almost impossible to record a speaker saying the same thing in the exact same way. So there's within speaker, but also across speaker differences. Now, the theoretical dilemma begins with taking this variability and trying to make this into these separate buckets or separate categories. Because if spoken language is highly dynamic and it happens to all of us very fast, how do then listeners categorize that highly varied speech signal, excuse me, into discrete units of information? So things like phonemes, features, or words for that matter. And for a very long time, our response to this question, this challenging question, was categorical perception, which has a very simplified argument to tackle with this really big question. It argues that a pre-categorical auditory encoding is warped by the presence of categories. Let me unpack that for you. What it tries to tell us is that listeners discard variation as long as they access the categories. So let me give you an example of what that might look like. So if we take a 10 millisecond difference for something simple as voice onset time. So let's say that we're talking about these simple stop consonants, b and p. They differ in terms of their voice onset time across different languages, but this comes from English. So categorical perception would argue that if there's 10 millisecond voice onset time difference that is crossing the boundary from b to a p sound, that is important, and listeners pay attention to that, because in order to figure out what is a b and what is a p, you need to know that 10 millisecond difference. But then the same 10 millisecond difference is not going to be important if you're within the category. So if you're looking at 5 millisecond to 15 millisecond, categorical perception will say that ignore that, nothing is going to change. I know that this is within the b sound. I don't care about any other information about this VOT. And empirically, we have wonderful examples or methodologies to test this. One of them is called as the two alternative choice, forced choice task, which we heavily use in psycholinguistic methods, but also across different disciplines that are involving language sciences and psychology. What 2AFC does is very simple. It will ask listeners or participants to choose one and drop the other one. This is exactly what categorical perception will want you to do. Drop the variation, stick to what matters to your category. So participants will hear different continua, and then they will choose, okay, this is X sound and not Y. So you will get this binary response, and you can fit a logistic function. You can look at the slope, and you can say that, well, if I observe a steep slope, that means that listeners are very good at understanding what is B, what is P. And if I have a shallow slope, that means that participants are struggling to identify what is a B, what is a P. They are not good at perceptual encoding. Oftentimes, that shallow slope has been also identified as something that's noisy in the perceptual encoding process. So in monolingual research or monolingual studies that focus on monolingual participants, this has been identified as having some sort of linguistic disability or having some language disorders, maybe some deficiency in the system. That shallow slope has always interpreted as deficiency in monolinguals. When it comes to bilingualism, it still maintained its interpretation as deficiency, but also it was associated with proficiency, age of acquisition. Maybe bilinguals do not have equal input in both languages, and that's why they're showing that shallow slope. But when we come to examine bilingual language development, what we're seeing is actually very counterintuitive to categorical perception, because as far as we know, none of the babies that we interact with growing up bilingually come to this world and their parents start telling them, now I'm speaking English, now I'm speaking Turkish. Babies don't get labels when they're listening to adults. And the other important part of this whole process is that babies, while gathering this information, if they need to keep that variation in their surrounding because they're just getting that bilingual exposure, they might just become gradient, or they might just show that shallow slope because they don't need sharp categories, because their environment does not require them to develop those sharp categories. So with my collaborators, what we've been doing is to challenge the idea of shallow slope being associated with deficit or deficiency in perceptual encoding or noise in the system. So in order to do this, we asked this simple question: what does a shallow or gradient slope mean? Because mathematically speaking, this shallow slope can occur for very different reasons. So we know the categorical profile, that's the sharp slope that participants or listeners switch from a ba to a pa sound. It's sharp because they're really good at activating the categories when the boundary is crossed. But for the gradient slope, they can occur for two distinct reasons that cannot be measured by 2AFC. Number one, participants can be gradient because they're following subphonetic details. So every time you play with voice onset time, participants might be paying attention to that variation, and they might be just trying to map it with what they're actually hearing. That will make them gradient participant. On the other hand, participants might in fact be noisy encoders, and that they're randomly selecting something during the experiment. So they will show some sort of a categorical profile, and as a result of our averaging process, their slope will also be shallow or low. So in order to eliminate this, methodologically, we switch to a task that's more ecological and more user-friendly for diverse linguistic input. And that task is called the visual analog scaling task. It's been using widely across different disciplines. This is, again, just taking that binary response and converting into a continuous measure. And when we take this VAS task, its psychometric properties eliminate the ambiguity of 2AFC. So we can actually identify who is truly gradient, who is truly noisy, and we already have what the categorical profile looks like. So in the VAS task, what we can achieve is that gradient slope differentiation can become very clear. Okay, so this is what the task looks like. We've been using this with young children, school-age children, teenagers, adults, individuals who are experiencing hearing loss, bilingual, monolingual, all sorts of different communities. We've been using this task very successfully. It's very simple. We use 2 images on the screen per each continuum. So this is a beach-peach continuum, and we play the different VOT manipulated sounds, and then we ask participants, where do you think the word falls to on that horizontal line? So participants can say that this is beach-like, but not a b sound. I hear some differences. They can say that it's closer to peach, but not really peach. And then they can say that, no, I heard something that's partially b, partially p, okay? So it's, again, giving participants the ability to use that subphonetic space so that they can accurately map what they're hearing. We can extract all these parameters. We can fit that logistic function, get the slope, max, min, also the crossover, the boundary. But beyond that, we can also calculate what we call as the response variability. So if participants are actually following each of or for every trial, when we play with the voice onset times, if they're following it very closely, their data points should be wrapping the slope function, that they're tightly following the experiment as we provide to them different acoustic or auditory signal. On the other hand, if we're seeing this pattern, which suggests high response variability, it seems like they are treating this task categorically. So they're on most of the times they're pressing the boundaries or using the boundaries, but they're doing so with noise, that they're randomly assessing if it's a beach or peach. And with VAS, again, we can differentiate this. So what we did was we took response variability and slope function, and we dimensionalized the space of categorization. So we argued that there should be 3 categories emerging, and we pre-registered this before we actually started the experiment. We said that the categorical profile is something that we all know. It's high slope, so sharp slope function, and low response variability, so people are not noisy. They're very good at categorizing speech sounds, and they stick with their categories. And the other one is the noisy profile. This time we will have that shallow slope or low slope and have high response variability. So people are showing that gradient slope while doing that. They're also being noisy. And we also had the gradient profile that is, again, distinct from the noisy profile, which suggests that the slope is still shallow, so low slope, but this time response variability is also low. So we conducted this study with children who we identify as linguistically diverse. So basically, from other terminology, we can call these individuals, these children, as heritage speaker, bilingual individuals who just started school in the United States. And what we did was we asked them to complete this VAS task in English. And we conducted a latent profile analysis to get those dimensions, to actually statistically assess if we can tap onto those 3 profiles. Again, this was our pre-registration graph. This is our data. So when we use response variability and slope, you can see that we get the noisy profile, we get the categorical profile, and we also get the gradient profile. And again, all of these children are bilingual individuals. So from that latent profile analysis, we can actually extract the probabilities for each child to be what the probability is for them to be in each of these profiles. We can get those directly from that latent profile analysis. So now I will show you these three profiles in three different path analysis with our social network measures. So beyond using their bilingualism experience, we actually asked their parents, what was the whole social structure looking like at the time of testing? So we asked them about number of people, the vocalization, hours of vocalization, but also bilingual exposure and how often that exposure was happening with each of these children. And now you will see those three variables coming with each of the profiles. So let's take a look at the gradient profile first. You're seeing that increased bilingual exposure is leading to increased chances of being in the gradient profile. So as children's environment become more bilingual, more linguistically diverse, they become more gradient. And again, this is what we were expecting, because if their linguistic environment is in flux and if it's gradient, why would these kids become categorical? There's no necessity for them to become categorical. And you can see that number of people and vocalization, neither of these two variables has any effect on the gradient profile. What about the categorical profile? Sorry, there's slight delay. Okay, there you go. So for categorical profile, this time bilingual exposure has no effect, but the two other social network measures do impact categorical profile negatively. Increased number of people and increased vocalization lead to decreased probabilities of being in the categorical profile, which suggests that being categorical really requires participants to have limited input that is unidirectional, input that does not vary, and it just makes these children very categorical. That also makes sense because, again, the more input you get for the same categories, the sharper your slope is going to become. And for the noisy profile, I would like to bring to your attention immediately the bilingual exposure. Being in a bilingual household or environment does not make these children noisy encoders. Increased bilingual exposure leads to decreased chances of being in the noisy profile. Again, it makes sense because those kids are already in the gradient profile. They're not becoming noisy encoders. They're not having deficiency. They're just showing shallow slope because their environmental or linguistic input is also gradient. For this one, increased number of people and increased hours of vocalization both did lead to having increased chances of being in a noisy profile. So we don't want to say much about noisy profile. We argue that this is something developmentally shifting, and that some sort of increased input momentarily might lead to some noise in encoding, that kids might just need a little bit more time to adjust their categories. But ultimately, being bilingual or having bilingual exposure has no effect on that noisy profile. It's not affecting, it's not making these kids noisy. You might ask, okay, so this is kids sample, kids are developing, they're different. What about adults? We did the exact same study with adult bilingual individuals, the same latent profile analysis. You're seeing the three classes emerging again. We have a significantly smaller sample of noisy individuals, which again goes with the idea that noise can be reduced while the development happens, but also noise can just, it might be just capturing input imbalance in the system. We also found that being bilingual, so bilingual individuals in the sample has reduced response variability compared to monolinguals. So they have less noise in their categorization compared to monolinguals. But beyond that, when we bring that social network analysis of unpacking their entire relationships of how many people they interact with, what are those individuals doing? Do they speak two languages? Are they speaking only one language? And what is the connections of each of these edges? So when we bring that information and boil it down to just bilingual exposure, I didn't want to overload you with all the network measures, but when we look at bilingual exposure, you're seeing the exact same patterns. increased bilingual exposure leads to increased chances of being in the gradient profile. And also it leads to decreased chances of being in the categorical and the noisy profile. In all of these path analyses, we controlled for English proficiency. So you can say that it's not about proficiency, it's not about age of acquisition, it is truly about the exposure that they receive and their system getting adapted to the input that they have around them. All right. So what I've been trying to show you with these couple of studies here is that there are different voice perception strategies. Some people are gradient, some people are categorical. We really shouldn't be calling some people deficient and other people not deficient. What we are seeing is just differences in terms of approaching speech perception. And as a function of the diversity that we observe in social network, some people become more gradient and some people become less gradient as a result of that. So I'm going to switch gears and move to another population that we know has taken a lot of attention, especially during recent years, but also for a very long time, and those are heritage speakers. This is the community that also always deals with a lot of deficiency delayed arguments. So what we observe with heritage speakers is that they're too late to be called native and too fluent to be called alto speakers. They're in that gray zone that people don't want to go into too much of a discussion when digging into the different types of analysis. So what we wanted to do is to challenge ourselves again and see what are we seeing with heritage speaker children who just start schooling in terms of their word recognition. What does the system look like? And if we see differences, then can we just move to understanding those differences without comparing them to monolingual children? So we focused on word recognition here because we know that word recognition actually predicts later life linguistic development. And it also has been found as one of the most fundamental parts of language development. So what it does, we use an eye tracker, which tracks eye movements of participants, which gives us millisecond by millisecond processing. And we play these words that we call as target words. So here the example is wizard. And while we're playing it, we assess what the participants are looking at on the computer screen. So before we start playing the audio file, we ask them to take a look at that middle dot just to get their eyes calibrated on that trial. And then upon the playing of the first syllable of the target word, we start looking at where they're looking at the computer screen. So if the target word is wizard, then we expect them to look at the wizard hat shape or whistle, because they both share the same first syllable. And when the word unfolds fully, we also expect them to momentarily look at the word lizard or the image that is associated with the word lizard, because that rhymes with the word wizard. We don't expect them to look at something like diamond, for instance. So there is, again, similar to VAS, there's trial to trial differences that we observe participants doing a bunch of different things, and then we get the averages of those, the proportions of looks. And what we observe is that the target looks get a lot of attention, so it gets it's increased as the word unfolds. The cohort, so in this case, whistle gets activated just slightly a little bit, and then lizard gets activated a little bit later, and we don't see much activation for the unrelated item. Traditionally speaking, this task has been used by looking at the curves or the target curves. So we're moving beyond that, and what we're doing is we're actually using principal component analysis with all these eye tracking measures in order to get different strategies, similar to what we did with the VAS task. So here we identify 3 profiles. We call these wait and see, sustained activation and slow activation rate. The same profiles as a result of this PCA analysis. We also observe these with individuals, monolingual adults who experience hearing loss. We also use this with developing children. And in all of these cases, we do observe the same profiles. So again, instead of calling one group because they're bilingual deficient, we move beyond that and we try to understand what their strategy, what do their strategies look like, and how can we assess that without moving into that understanding of comparing them to monolingual individuals. All right, so I hope so far I was able to transfer this message of theoretical limitations in understanding diversity, but also beyond that, methodological limitations in measuring diversity. As can be seen from the example of categorical perception and 2AFC, there's so many other things in our methodologies and our theories that are ingrained so that we cannot tap into diversity. But ultimately, what we're seeing is as adaptation to the linguistic environment has been identified as deficiency for a very long time. So it is time for us to move away from that approach. Now, in the second part of my talk, I will be taking all of these and putting them into another section while going into the ecological and experiential outcomes. So this is going to be more applied in the sense that how the theories and methodologies that we use, the studies that we came out with, what did those do to our bilingual participants and communities? And it all will start again with the same idea that listeners encounter highly varied speech, but that variation has not been taken into account in many different spaces. So what we observe is actually the multilingual reality is people growing up in multilingual environments, but they're brought into monolingual ideologies where they have to face those monolithic arguments of what language should look like, what languaging is, and who should be called the best languagers in that space. So oftentimes we're criticized of not bringing diversity to our labs, but the reality is that before individuals come to our labs, some of that diversity has been stripped out from their identity. So this whole section is about that part of having the bilingual experience. So in a recent framework, we propose these 3 layers of understanding bilingualism. We call this as the systems approach of understanding bilingualism. And what it does, it uses the ecology or the ecological approaches. We have the societal level information. This is where we see beliefs about languages, attitudes towards languages or accents and varieties or dialects. And all of those have a direct impact on the ecology. So if a language is highly stigmatized, we also observe that those languages are not coming to our workplaces. Our colleagues are not speaking in those languages, or those languages are not coming to our schools. We also don't get to see those languages in our neighborhoods through redlining. And it immediately has an effect on our person-to-person interactions, because if those languages are erased, those identities are erased, then the way that we interact with our friends, significant others, and all the other individuals will also be impacted by those ideologies. So let me give you an example from the societal level. If you look at those language attitudes in society, we can see clear examples of still negative attitudes associated with being a bilingual. So for this study, we collected Twitter data. This was before Elon Musk, so please don't tell him because he might charge us. So we downloaded tweets when it was free, and we did a corpus-assisted analysis of the whole discourse. So I'm just showing you one example of a word like job, which is just a neutral word, and how that occurred in our 30 million word corpus. You can see that people lost their jobs. They had to protect their families because they were speaking Spanish, or that they were assumed to be unskilled workers. And just to give you a little bit more background, this entire study was on Spanish-English bilinguals in the United States. So we specifically collected tweets from the United States. But beyond that, it gets even worse and more traumatizing, because a lot of individuals actually reported their experiences and their lived experiences of encountering trauma where they were blamed to be not raised skilled individuals in the American society, and they were threatened to be, or their parents were threatened that they will call child services because they're not speaking English. And these are just some of the examples that we can bring from our corpus. There are hundreds of other examples like this, that people actually had to change their direction or their grocery stores because someone was saying something very harsh, or that they were actually taken away from their families because they were speaking Spanish. So you might think that, okay, so this is just people experiencing discrimination. How is it going to affect the whole society or the way that people process language? Well, it does have a direct effect on the society and our communities. With my collaborators, we used another social network approach where we brought Spanish-English bilinguals into our lab, and we conducted that network survey or questionnaire to understand how much Spanish is left in their social network. So I will show you 3 graphs. Each of these graphs will represent one individual. They're all Spanish-English bilinguals. And each of the dots in those images will represent people in their social network. And the colors of those dots will represent what language those individuals use with the participant. So in this case, everyone is speaking English with the participant. And some of these individuals know one another, as you can see here. And then these 2 individuals don't know anybody, the rest of the network. And again, there's no English and Spanish or no Spanish. This person came to our lab indicating that they're Spanish-English bilingual. Now, if you look at the second person, there is an English network that is not connected to their English and Spanish network at all. So this individual experienced 2 split ways of experiencing their bilingualism in their everyday life. And if you look at the third person, it's a clear example of 3-generational shift, where the left side is their family network. The grandparents speak in Spanish to both mom and dad. Mom and dad spoke Spanish and English to participant. Sibling to sibling interactions are only in English. So from the grandparents to the participants, there's that generational shift. And their friend network is mostly in English. There are only 2 individuals who use English and Spanish with the participant and also with one another. So you can see that those ideologies that are basically not letting bilinguals experience their bilingualism are also reflected in the ways that they continue using their languages. In the first participant, there's no Spanish left in their immediate social network. So at this point, you might be wondering, well, maybe this is about language. Maybe Spanish is highly stigmatized in the United States, and maybe we're just having a sampling bias. I will give you a spoiler alert, that is not correct. And I have actually evidence to show you why that's not the case. So as I mentioned before we bring participants, maybe they're losing that diversity component. That was the beginning of this whole second section. Now I will switch from Spanish-English bilingualism to speaking a majority language with a different accent or variety. And for that one, what we did was we took English because of its colonial history. We focused on 3 English varieties. We can also call these 3 different English accents. So here, Indian English emerged as a result of exploitation colonialism that's conducted by British Empire. And American English emerged as a result of settler colonialism, again, that started from British Empire. So the way that these 2 accents emerge have very distinct, different pathways. And we know from racial linguistic literature that this has huge importance in understanding how people treat these varieties or accents. So when we bring participants into our lab and ask them to listen to these accents, we now know that we're doing something within the language, right? So we're not comparing to another language, so there's no Spanish here, it's just within English. How do they behave if we trick them to believe that they're hearing different speech instances? So this is a form of match guys technique where we prepared our stimuli such that American English will be presented with white faces in one trial. So participants will hear a sentence like the color of a lemon is yellow, very simple, nothing tricky about these sentences. We ask participants to write down what they heard. And then we also ask them to judge whether the speaker had accent in relative to their own perceived accent. A couple trials later, we'll switch the faces on the computer screen. So they will hear the same speaker, but this time they saw a South Asian face. So we measured whether that face change did trigger any of these attitudes towards different varieties or accents of English language. We wanted to account for racial diversity in these individual social network, but you're seeing that when they were typing down these sentences, there's no group effect. The only reason why I'm showing these two groups side by side is to show you that there was indeed no group effect. But what we did find was whenever we paired American English with South Asian faces, intelligibility went down. So people were less accurate when they were transcribing sentences. The same speech stimuli, when we presented with white faces, they were at ceiling. They typed everything down perfectly. The minute we switched to South Asian faces, intelligibility dropped down. This happened for British English, and it also happened for Indian English for both groups. Now, what about their accent misjudgments? This time, y-axis is the level that they associate, the accent misjudgments that they associate with each speaker. The higher the number is, it means that they found the speaker being farther away from their accent or heavily accented. This time we found a group difference when we compare racial less diverse and racially more diverse group, and that only happened for British English. Racially more diverse group judge British English as being less accented overall compared to racially less diverse group. But also beyond that, for both groups, we found this very interesting effect that the same American English all of a sudden became more accented when we presented the same speech stimuli with South Asian faces. And both groups showed that. For Indian English, another interesting example, only when we present it with white faces, people judge it as being less accented, as you can see here. So this whole framework or the ecology that we're working with at the societal level, the ways that we assess attitudes, they have direct impact on each of these layers. And you can see by the way that people losing Spanish in their social network, or by the way that they're judging other people's accents. But we wanted to challenge ourselves one more time. So this time we conducted the exact same study in Montreal, Canada, where we know that there's a little bit more racial and ethnic diversity and linguistic diversity. The previous study was conducted in Central Florida in a small college town, which is Gainesville. You will see it again one more time coming up. So we assess Montreal and Gainesville differences, not only through our social network analysis, but also we did conduct an entropy measure to understand whether bilingualism or linguistic diversity, they're indeed different. And you can see that they are different, that Montreal has more linguistic diversity compared to Gainesville, even though in both locations, we only tested bilingual individuals. Same study, nothing changed. We literally use everything as it was back in the first study. And this time we're seeing completely different results. So for Gainesville, we replicated our previous findings. The minute we change faces from a white face to South Asian face, intelligibility went down. But if you look at Montreal, everything is at ceiling. This is psycholinguist nightmare. But this was exactly what we were hoping to get, because as I mentioned earlier, all of these sentences were extremely simple. We did not do any tricks on these sentences. People should have been transcribing them very accurately, okay? What about accented misjudgments? You're seeing on the x-axis this time, the judgments. So the right side will be heavy judgments and then or heavily accented and low accented or closer to my own accent. So what Gainesville people did, again, they used this hierarchy of positioning British English in the middle. So British English was not as heavily accented as Indian English or not less accented as American English. There was also the maintenance of that face effect. Every time we switch from a white face to South Asian face, accent misjudgments increased. If you look at Montreal, on the other hand, they map British English and Indian English to be equally accented, no face effect. And for American English, no face effect, and then they judge American English overall being closer to their own perceived accent. So in Montreal, people use the acoustic space to indicate their accent misjudgments, whereas in Gainesville, people use the societal level values of understanding bilingualism, understanding variation, and when with that understanding and position British English, British English in the middle. All right, so I hope that the message is becoming clearer, because it is never about the language. It is about everything outside of language that we think that we're evaluating language. So we know voice adaptation happens very quickly to listeners, and during communication, it's very, very fast process. But that adaptation is also bound to ecological factors. And in a society, if you maintain those monolingual ideologies, those ideologies are adapted very quickly by perceivers. So in this section, I try to show you those multilingual realities that exist in monolingual ideologies. But of course, those monolingual ideologies are not just living by themselves. They're set norms that we at some point decided that they represent the overall sample or the overall population. But when it comes to understanding diversity, what we're seeing is that composition and perceptual processing of voices are very complicated. And in fact, it's very good that they're complicated because voices are complicated and they have to be complicated because voices are sitting in the intersection of our identities. So when we judge someone's voice as being deficient, delayed, or having some lacking of linguistic properties, we're actually trying to erase identities without explicitly saying that. So I hope that this whole presentation was able to show you the limitation of categories with the false objectivity of cognitive imperialism, how we push these categories and what that means to our own edges, to our own communications. And with the network approach, I hope that I was able to show you that those edges are sometimes sharp, and it's good, again, that they're sharp. Those are sometimes complex, and it's good that they're complex because nothing about our voices is simple, and it shouldn't be simple. So going back to this code, I hope that now you know when we interpret our findings as X or Y or saying this is deficient, this is not deficient, that we're amplifying some voices and we're discreetly erasing other voices. And next time when you detect something like this, or maybe you're trying to interpret your own data, but you don't know how to approach that, maybe ask this question: that whose voices am I amplifying at this moment? With that, I will say that it's good that we're talking about diversity, and it is time to talk about diversity. And I hope that it will remain with us for a very long time. This talk has been, again, a big privilege in my career, and I hope that I was able to share with my research with you all in the ways that my collaborators, I wish some of them were here. I know some of them are online, but one person that I would like to highlight, Savitri Namritipad, who has been a very important figure in my career. And she and I recently formed this role collective where we actually talk about, or we try to investigate linguistic injustice that we observe in our research, but also at the institutional level, and also moving beyond academia, how we maintain these ideologies in everything that we do. So I hope you will take a look at our website. And if you have any questions about Role Collective, please come talk to me. I'm more than happy to discuss. With that, I would like to thank you all for your attention, for all our participants, University of Iowa, and many other teams that are involved in University of Iowa, the funding agencies, and of course, organizers of ISB 14. Thank you.